Okay, actually, Izge has just gone out, but I'd like us to start because I've got quite a lot to say, or a few maps to look at before we then move on to our DNA articles and so on. So let's briefly kind of remind ourselves of the point we reached in the last class, and then we'll try and follow that through in a kind of logical way. So we've been looking at the movement of peoples around Britain and to some extent Ireland. We'll say a bit about those today and more, I think, on Thursday about next week about Ireland during the late and sub-Roman periods. So here is a map which, based on primarily archaeological finds, argues the situation for Kirka round about AD 500. We can ignore these kingdom names at the moment. We're going to start dealing with the sort of political situation, if that's the right word, on Thursday, but we're concerned more with people situation here. But you can see we've got, you may not be able to see, we've got Jutes, Saxons and Angles here. We talked about those and we tried to compare the archaeological finds from Britain with the continent last week. And this is the situation in terms of artifacts which archaeologists believe indicate some kind of English or Anglo-Saxon presence on a relatively large scale by the end of the 5th century. Obviously, this grey area will slowly expand during the next 100 years, and we'll be starting to look at that on Thursday, and we'll look at these names, as I said. What I'm going to do now is have a look a little bit at the other side, what's going on elsewhere. But before we do that, let's just take a few maps which indicate onomastic place name evidence to supplement this kind of archaeological stuff. Here is a map showing English place names which refer to Anglo-Saxon pagan practices in one way or another. Now, for example, we talked about the pagan god Woden last week briefly, and a number of place names preserve the name Woden. We've got a few here. Let me have a look so I can see. Wednesfield or something like that here, Whedon and so on. And also the god Thunor, Thor for the Vikings, of course, and we see Thunderfield and so on here. So these place names primarily focusing in the southern part of Britain and to some extent in the eastern side, but moving into the Midlands a little bit over here as well. And obviously the Anglo-Saxons, again, we'll talk about this in detail next time, but the Anglo-Saxons were pagan primarily when they arrived in Britain, but during the 6th and into the 7th century, we see the conversion of different Anglo-Saxon groups, kingdoms, to Christianity. So where we see a name which has a pagan significance, it indicates not necessarily the beginning, but relatively early settlement. Okay, these are the areas where the pagan Anglo-Saxons were occupying an area or taking over a settlement or setting up a new settlement and things like that. And this, more or less, but to a lesser extent, reflects the same map that we looked at before. It's this area of early settlement. On the other hand, a different place name map, which I don't know how clear that is for you over there again, but these are place names which indicate some degree of British or Welsh continuity. Okay? They indicate that people who were regarded as Britons or Welsh by the English were surviving. So they are place names which either have Welsh elements in, but the English have taken over the name. Okay, so I think this one here is Pen, okay, which is the Welsh, modern Welsh word with one N for head, for example. Now, one scenario, one very common scenario for the Anglo-Saxon movement into Britain was that it was a fairly large-scale and rather violent event, so that the Anglo-Saxons came in and more or less killed the native Britons or pushed them further westwards into Wales and Cornwall and so on, and then took over the main part of what became, therefore, England. This kind of evidence suggests perhaps otherwise, that other patterns were going on. If you have places, this one is called Comberton. Let me write that one up because you can't see it very well. Okay, ton is the word town in English. So this is an English place name, but the Comber bit, okay, is related to, well, the modern Welsh word for a Welshman. Cymro means a Welshman in Welsh, okay. Combroges or something in earlier Welsh. So this is the town of the Welshman. Okay, so this suggests, if we interpret it correctly, that this was a settlement in which some Britons, or Welsh if we want to call them, were living at the time when the English arrived, and they were not obviously completely wiped out in that sense. And then somewhere with the name Pen, which actually has a Welsh name, this is a Welsh word, okay. Now if you're all the Welsh, and I come marching in, Anglo-Saxon David, and kill you all, and then say, okay, let's live here. What's this place called? But you're all dead, so you can't tell me what it's called, so we give it an English name, okay? But in this case, there must have been at least one Briton alive, maybe on the gasping breath to say, Pen, and then he dies. But more likely, okay, there was some degree of cultural activity, maybe even a large British-speaking population continued there. They kept their own place name. It wasn't replaced by an English one. So we get a degree of coexistence or whatever up to a point. And this is primarily in the Midlands, these place names, mostly in the Midlands of England, not so much in the west, in the south and the east, in the Midlands. So as we move to the Midlands, as the English kind of move into this area, okay, we get more and more of these Welsh place names, suggesting at least in the central parts we get more of an interaction, okay. Perhaps not so much in these areas, but certainly around here we get a more interactive situation emerging. Okay, another map, this time showing the western parts of Britain primarily, okay. Here we see two things indicated, okay. The dots, lobs, show sites where archaeologists have found what they call imported pottery. And that is things made from clay, pots of one sort or another, ceramics, which they also find in what is now France, in Western Gaul. And they think they've been brought into these western parts of Britain and Ireland by traders or by contact with Gaul. So there's nothing much going on here in what's becoming England, but there's a contact this way round with the continent, with the western parts of Gaul and so on. And this shows a kind of cultural region. We sometimes call this area the Irish Sea province, whatever. And the shaded areas, the slash lines, indicate the distribution of a certain kind of inscription, which means digging words into, cutting words, engraving words into stone, called ogham, okay, or om, sometimes spelt without the H, which is primarily characteristic of Ireland. Okay, so it's something characteristic of parts of Ireland. I'll show you an example of this now. We'll come back to this one. Ogham inscriptions may involve ordinary Latin or Latin alphabet writing, but down the edge of a large stone, the corner bit, they would cut lines, okay, some on this side, some on that side, some crossing over, and so on, and some straight, some slanting, and they all had a phonetic value. Okay, this was something which was developed in Ireland, so it's a kind of inscription. Perhaps they suggest the idea was developed in Ireland, but the idea of writing they'd copied from something going on in Britain and so on, but it's characteristic originally of Ireland. So when we see Ogham inscriptions like this one in parts of Wales or even in parts of southwest England, it suggests some kind of contact with Ireland or even some settlement. Okay, and many of the names, some of the names are even Irish names. Most of them over here in Ireland, in the southern parts, and to some extent further north. Okay. Now we have documentary references, small little references, one that suggests people called the Déisi, who lived in County Waterford, settled in the area which is now becomes Dyfed in southwest Wales, and another reference to some kind of Irish settlement in southwest England as well. But these settlements have disappeared. The big movement of Irish people was into the Scottish Isles and ultimately Scotland. I'm going to start talking about that in our next topic. Okay, that has an impact. These ones effectively have disappeared. There's no people speaking Irish in these areas anymore. They've become assimilated with the British or Welsh population. But there's strong evidence that this kind of movement was not insignificant. Here's a map for Wales showing two things. The little round dots are the Ogham inscriptions, and the little, they're black to you, but they're little triangle shapes, are Welsh place names that have an Irish element. So they suggest Irish settlers bringing their language in. Okay, again, primarily focused in the southern and western regions, a little bit dotted up here in Anglesey, but primarily down here. This is where we get documentary evidence for these things. So a strong set of patterns and a little bit of the Ogham inscriptions in what becomes Brecon over there. So we see movements of people, some of them having a big impact, the creation of England by the Anglo-Saxons, the creation of what eventually becomes Scotland by the Irish, Scotty in the north. We'll talk about that later, as I said. But even here we see movements of people going on, presumably in fairly significant degree, but ultimately becoming assimilated with the local population and fading out. Our example of the inscription here, let's just have a quick look at this. Okay, pull it down a bit so we can see the whole thing. What conclusions do you think we can draw? If I just give you this, what ideas might we get from this stone? This is, okay, a memoria, so it's a commemoration, it's remembering someone, it's remembering vote por regis, praetic, it says there, bad Latin, protectoris, the protector, some kind of leader, okay, called vortipor or whatever. And here when we transcribe the Ogham, we get more or less the same, right? But with remember, Q Celtic, P Celtic, okay? So this is vote cor igas in the archaic Irish, but they're essentially the same name. We think there may be other references, at least two other references to this guy, but we'll talk about him next time. People argue about whether it's the same person or not. But just on the face of it, what can we say about this man who was possibly buried under or near this stone, or is being at least remembered in this stone that was set up in southwest Wales? What comments can we draw from this, culturally, politically, or of any sort? Any thoughts?
He's obviously someone of importance. They wouldn't have
Right.
took the time to do this if he was just a common peasant.
Yeah, if he was just some peasant farmer, then he wouldn't probably have a memorial stone set up. So he's some kind of big guy, bigwig in what's now Dyfed at that time. The fact that we've got the sort of pseudo-Latin and the Ogham archaic Irish indicates, as we said, that there's he may have Irish ancestry. Sorry, Özge?
Kind of Latin involvements.
Yes, I mean...
And the people who are ruling the city, or I don't know, but there's a Latin involvement.
Right, which means Rome, which means some kind of continuity with the Roman world, and he's calling himself Protector. He's got a Latin title, so he saw himself as somehow perhaps even as a Roman in a strange way. But his stone also had the Irish inscription. This was a very mixed kind of population that both looked to the Roman world but also recognized the importance of the Irish. Perhaps he had dual ancestry or something, or at least the people he ruled over were significantly Irish as well, that they had to have the ogam there. Cross, what does that mean? Christianity, okay. This guy or his people were Christian in some kind of a way, okay, part of the Christian world, the Roman world, therefore. Though, of course, the spread of Christianity in Ireland, which had never been part of the Roman Empire, was kind of going on at this point, perhaps, or was quite well established at this point. But Ogam inscriptions, very early ones, are pagan in nature. So again, the duality between what we might call British, Roman, Christian, and then the Irish element set up here and so on. So even a single, okay, Genghis?
Like the barbarian Christians that accepted it, were British Christians Aryan? Or
There were, no, I mean, he would have been, well, he would have been Celtic Christian. There's all sorts of arguments what that is. The Aryan thing, whether it like with the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths and so on, we don't get that so much in Britain. We had our own heresies, like the Pelagian heresy and so on in the late Roman world, but Arianism, I don't think, was such a big deal in late Roman Britain, but I'm sure there were Arians there. But it's not an issue that we talk about when we get to this level. Exactly the finer subtleties of theological debate are not always very clear from something like this. Fatih?
Wasn't the circle cross is special for Ireland?
Well, that's interesting. Okay. If you actually have a nice memorial where you want to have actually carve a cross, physically the stone won't be so strong, so you might often have a kind of wheel shape like this to support the cross. So I don't know whether that's an interesting point. I would have to think about that, whether this is a common symbol which reflects attempts to make, in the later period at least, to have proper crosses or not. I'd have to think about that, so I can't answer your question. Okay, so that's one example of the kind of person we're dealing with in this kind of dark period. Okay, a mixture of kind of Christian and possibly pagan, of settled and native, Roman and non-Roman, and all these kind of things. And this is a case from South Wales. The last little couple of maps I want to show before we look at our genetic stuff is, get them the right way around. Two relating to what is now Brittany in northwest France. Okay, what had been the Roman province of Armorica is now to a large extent called Brittany because it was settled by people from Britain, okay, British people. I've kind of coloured over this to make patterns more clear and for various reasons, but this is a map showing place names, various kinds of place names, which are regarded as containing P-Celtic, Brittonic elements, okay, in Brittany. And then the lines indicate the expected extent of Breton during the later period and so on. So I've coloured over these here. So these are the areas that indicate some kind of settlement in the form of names, place names with a British element. Okay, people coming from southwest and perhaps southern Britain and settling in these areas. Same map but with different things indicated is the green area deliberately here. These are place name elements with ak and so on, containing possibly older Roman elements in their names, going back to the Roman period. And if we try and superimpose the two maps on each other, which may, oops, touched it. Is that working? Okay, that's not too bad. we can see that the red areas are kind of primarily here with a bit of overlap, and the green is down here as well. They're not entirely mutually exclusive, but there is a certain overlap up this way as well. But primarily we see the British place names further west and to some extent in the north, and the Roman survival names further south and east to a large extent, no, not exclusively. So we can see here again the arrival of Bretons, in some areas presumably Britons becoming Bretons, large-scale settlement. The further west, the further east we go and south, perhaps the population continuing more from the previous late Roman population, but interacting with the newcomers as well. These people, we can either see them as kind of escaping from southern Britain in the wake of the arrival of the English, or else, I mean, Procopius, the Greek writer, says it was just overpopulation. Too many people in Britain, so people were sailing across the sea to find land where they could settle, and they ended up in what is now Armorica. Okay, presumably, each individual settler had his or her own reasons for doing this. A final map relating to Brittany, but showing, again, this western areas here. These are what are called Welsh peregrini. They are Welsh saints, holy men, Christian saints from Wales, who have effectively moved around. Okay, some of them are said to have settled in Brittany, but many of them, their cult, the worship of these people, has moved. And these are all churches which, at an early date, were dedicated, were named to one of these saints. We can see in Wales, they're coming from, again, from the Dyfed area, primarily in the south. Okay, we found clusters of them in what's now England, but we also found a lot of them, again, in the northern part of Brittany. And this, again, is natural. If you're moving, you take your saints and your religious life with you, but it also may indicate a continued connection between these areas. It wasn't just people fleeing from here, but there was connection with the Britons in Brittany, into southern Britain, and even into Wales. Okay, there's a kind of cultural region building up during this dark period of our time. Okay, any questions here? Any thoughts? This has all been quite quick, so we've got 20 minutes or so on our texts. Any thoughts? We'll look at Scotland and Ireland in the next few weeks, because I haven't covered them in detail yet. But let's take out the 3 articles I asked you to look at. And as a kind of preface to this, I can make that smaller. No, wrong way. See what that's got to say there. Okay, as I've mentioned on more than one occasion in the past few weeks, in addition to the traditional ways of studying the past, Chokyashar, historians using written documents, but also, particularly for the Middle Ages, historians using archaeological, place name, and linguistic evidence to try and understand what's going on. For the past decade or so, there's been a growing use of genetic evidence to study the human past. Okay. We can study current DNA. All of us in this room are kind of living history. We're carrying the historical imprint of our paternal and maternal ancestors in our genes. Similarly, we can study the past by using non-human organic organisms. Organic organisms, that's not a good phrase. But we can study the past in the same way, looking at the genes of dogs or plants as well that are existing now. And we can also study the past using ancient DNA, sometimes called aDNA with a little a there, which is the DNA of human and non-human organisms dug up by archaeologists, and then, if they're lucky, they can extract some genetic information from these finds. Okay, that's a rather more difficult thing to do. What we're going to look at today is primarily using the current DNA rather than the ancient DNA, but that's rather interesting as well. I mean, we now know, for example, that modern humans are not descended directly from Neanderthals. Okay, we've analysed the DNA of Neanderthal remains, and we can see that we are kind of cousins, but we're not linearly related and things like that. So that's where ancient DNA obviously can be quite important. The DNA which scholars look at when they analyse our blood or whatever, there are the chromosomes. Okay, now they are nuclear DNA. They're in the nucleus of cells. Okay, and there are 23 pairs of chromosomes called autosomes, and then there's one pair of sex chromosomes, which are the Y, X and Y, okay, which you all know about from biology and things like that. Okay. In addition, we can study mitochondrial DNA, sometimes called mtDNA or mDNA. Do we know anything about that? Anyone know what mitochondrial DNA is, where it exists in the cells or anything? Come across that? That's here. It's in the outside part of the cell, not the nucleus. It's outside, okay, and it's concerned with the energy of cells and things like that. It may even originally have come from outside the original organisms that make up a cell or whatever. But there's a big difference between using the chromosomes and the mitochondrial DNA. Now, primarily, as we've seen here, scholars look at the Y chromosomes of individuals, because when we inherit our chromosomes, we take one from each parent, obviously, to make up the pair, okay? We definitely get an X from our mother, so each one of us has got one of our mother's X's, but we don't know which one, okay, because she's got it from her different parents. And if you're me, you get your Y from your father, but if you're Azra, you get the other X from your father, okay, which makes you female. So the Y is the particularly stable one, because my Y chromosome I've taken from my father, and there's no ambiguity of that. And my father got it from his father, and his father got it from his. And in theory, our Y chromosome, unless we get significant mutation, goes back generations and generations. It's the same for all the guys in the room. And I'm sorry, girls, it's more difficult with X's. We can't say where they come from. But we can definitely say the guys get their Y chromosome from their father, and that can be plotted then, okay? Mitochondrial DNA, we've all got mitochondrial DNA from our mothers, okay? When the egg is fertilized in the mother's womb and so on, during that process of fertilization, the mitochondrial DNA in the sperm is destroyed. So unfortunately, the guy's mitochondrial DNA goes, and only the mother's mitochondrial DNA is passed on to the what's going to become the baby. So each and every one of us has lost our father's mtDNA, but kept our mother's. So just as Y chromosome, but just for guys, can be used to trace things back paternally, for each and every one of us, not just ladies, all of us, our mitochondrial DNA traces our maternal descent, from me to my mum, to her mum, and back, things like that. So we've got these two kinds of DNA which scholars look at. I'll just add one other brief comment, because it's quite interesting. There is a kind of genetic virus which exists in urine, in our bodies, okay? It's a kind of what's called a pallioma virus, and it's the human one of that. It doesn't cause a disease in most people, but majority of us have carrying it. It's a kind of non-deadly virus that we have. Okay? And it's usually passed not genetically between people, but it's given between people who live closely together. So families or close tribes will usually have the same form of this virus, which exists in their urine and then is excreted and so on. And there's been some studies, but not for British history, that's tried to analyse human movement, not just by our own DNA, but also by looking at this genetic virus, which most of us carry as well. Okay, but that's fairly early on. I've come across a few studies on the web about that, but not relating to British history whatsoever. Okay, so we've got 3 papers. Michael E. Wheel et al., Y chromosome evidence for Anglo-Saxon mass migration, published in 2002, I think, yes. The following year, an overlapping group, but slightly different group, published a Y chromosome census of the British Isles. And then slightly later, 2006, Mark Thomas, who's an author of both those papers, and a couple of other guys, but not one of them is not a geneticist, published evidence for an apartheid-like social structure in Anglo-Saxon England. So this isn't new research, but it's new interpretation. So let's call this paper 1. Chronologically, we'll call this one paper 1. We'll call this one paper 2. And the evidence for apartheid-like social structure, we can call that 3, okay, just to make it a bit easier for ourselves to look at these things. So, can someone tell me primarily what is the main argument of paper number 1? Okay, Y chromosome evidence for Anglo-Saxon mass migration. What is this paper suggesting? What's the concern here? Fatih?
It suggests the Y chromosomes or genes of the ancient British or medieval British people and the Norway people are similar to each other, or Friesland.
Friesland, yes, yeah. Let's not say Norway.
Okay, similar to each other, but not in Wales, because since it suggests that there is an eastern movement to Friesland. Friesland's people moved from eastern to Britain, so there were Britons who moved out to Wales, who don't want to mix them up, mix with them up. So it generally suggests the gene similarity.
Right, okay.
And the evidence of the Anglo-Saxon relation.
Yeah, okay, so that, yeah, okay. It's taken as evidence of Anglo-Saxon migration. Friesland is Frisia. It's that area a little bit to the west of Germany and Denmark, into Netherlands, where I said the Frisians speak the language closest to what is now English. Okay, so they've picked some guys off the streets in Frisia and so taken their blood. They've also taken blood from these places, this is my map I should have, taken from these places across, more or less a line across Britain. So 5 in England and then 2 in different parts of Wales. And they've tried to draw conclusions about the medieval past based upon the DNA of these, and I hope that the 7 men are still living. And they also took some samples from Norway because, as we shall discuss in a few weeks' time, there was a certain amount of Viking, Norwegian, Scandinavian presence in later England as well, a little bit later on, but they're concerned here primarily with the Anglo-Saxons. And as Fatih said, they found that the English blood samples were very close to the Frisian ones, somewhere here, whereas the 2 Welsh ones were very different. Okay? And all were a bit different from what was going on in Norway. And I think they also suggest that these two Welsh ones are a bit different from each other as well, okay? But they're definitely kind of different from these. And they conclude, therefore, their conclusion is that this proves that there was what they're calling mass migration, large-scale migration from the continent into Britain. People were bringing their genes into, at least into these areas, and they're presuming into other areas as well, on such a large scale that what had been British DNA surviving possibly in this part of Britain had disappeared. Okay, was wiped out as these people were either killed or, as Fatih says, pushed westwards into Wales and so on. I was going to say, any questions or problems with this? Go on.
In the Dutch people, for the Dutch people, or for the Scandinavian people, isn't this area of Scotland as the better conditions and being appropriate, isn't it more suitable than the south? Why they migrate to south?
Who are we talking about? The Norwegians or the Frisians?
Angles.
The Angles. So, well, primarily because it's closer. We're talking about people who are living, I mean, I can't extend them out, but we're up here somewhere. So they're coming this way and that way, okay? And eventually up to here as well, okay? We'll talk about this next time. Scotland proper is quite a long way north for them, and the North Sea is quite a strong sea. So people coming from here are going to come this way, push that way, and push that way. So that's the pattern that we see, though this push is a little bit later. Okay. Norwegians coming at a later stage, the Vikings, that's a different story. They do come through the north, okay, and that's a different thing. Now, if you wanted to criticize, if I asked you to criticize this study, not that I'm suggesting you become experts in molecular biology all of a sudden, but what criticisms might we venture, either about the methodology or even about the interpretation, the conclusions that they might draw?
Low number of samples.
Right, okay, that's quite small, isn't it? Okay, they've taken a kind of cross-section across, but there aren't that many samples. They've taken them from a number of people from these towns and so on, and you try and make sure it's people who've families have been living there for a long time and so on, but it's still, I would say, it seems to me anyway, quite a small number of samples, and it's not a large-scale survey of the whole of Britain by any means. Anything else?
And also the Y chromosome. Actually, we also have X chromosome, so the maternal ancestry is quite vague in this.
Yeah, well, there's no maternal ancestry here. They're talking about male migration. We can't say much about what the women are doing because they haven't looked at the mitochondrial DNA. Now, the problem with the X is that it's not so clear-cut. The Y goes from man to man to man, only in one direction. The X, you can get one or the other from either parent, so of course it's higgledy-piggledy in a sense. But the mitochondrial DNA is a clearer pattern. Now, they haven't looked at that here, okay, in this paper, so that's the other thing. So, what do we mean by mass migration? Do we mean large numbers of men and women migrating? Well, this only proves that large numbers of men are migrating, possibly. It doesn't say anything about the women. Though they might bring their women, or they might say, leave those behind in Frisia or wherever, and we're all going to go and go, yeah, something like that, find some British babes or something, who knows, okay? So again, it would be good to have a mitochondrial DNA to kind of counterbalance the Y evidence here, which is what we might look at elsewhere and so on. And on the interpretation side, and this is the problem, I think, we need to think about the methodology of using these kind of studies, is we get patterns, like all the maps I've been showing you, okay? And quite naturally, as humanists, as historians, we don't really know much about the scientific side. We're not trained as geneticists or something. So it all seems very clever. And they've got these papers with lots of tables and figures that we don't understand. As I said, you understand the first page and the last page, and that's about it. The rest of it looks very clever. They must be right and so on. I'm sure they've got the scientific side. But interpreting this is more difficult. Okay? A pattern can mean a number of things. As we've said with archaeological remains, does it mean someone's moved from here to there? Does it mean he's traded? Does it mean there's been a fashion trend and we're all wearing the same kind of belt buckle or something like that? And maybe it's the same here. Just the fact that these guys have got similar DNA and these guys have got slightly different DNA, does that mean it has to be 100% mass migration from there to there or whatever? Okay, and they consider some other possibilities. And that leads us to the third paper. So skipping over number 2 for the moment, evidence for an apartheid-like social structure in early Anglo-Saxon England. Now, apartheid, of course, we know from South Africa, is a legalized or semi-legalized system of controlling different groups, ethnic or other, in this case, ethnic groups within a society, and to some extent keeping them socially and legally separate. So what are the authors of this paper? They're taking the same basic evidence to some extent and trying to provide a slightly different interpretation. They're saying, here's the pattern, but we can explain it in a different way. What are these 3 authors saying from paper number 3? Assuming that any of you had time to read this in the intervening few days.
I don't think so, but intermarriage.
Right.
I couldn't explain myself, I think, but.
We'll try. We've got a few minutes, don't worry.
Intermarriage serve a homogenized society in order to it was mainly about not the pure genetics. I can summarize. Genetics was by chromosome study, of course, provided good stuff for the studies ethnicity of British Isles, but they had a more social viewpoint, I guess. As she said, the marriage and the economic activities, their power in the society. According to that, their birth rate maybe could change, or it could have changed the pattern from the one in the first article.
Yeah. Something different, a different mechanism, historical mechanism, they are suggesting has led to this distribution of DNA amongst these 7 towns in Britain. Okay, they're suggesting. So in the first one, we're saying the immediate reaction is if there's lots of this DNA, it means lots of people with that DNA came in hundreds of years ago and took over that area, and they didn't take over that area. That's how we've got this separation. In this paper, they're trying to look at it, interpret it in a different way. Okay, now one of the starting points is some early Anglo-Saxon laws. From the very early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, we have a number of law codes from the very early phases of Anglo-Saxon settlement or occupation and control of parts of Britain. And in some of these law codes, people called Welsh, which either means British or it means slave, and it's not always clear which one, or maybe they're the same thing. It shows that Welsh people existed in those societies. They were not completely killed, like the guy saying, this is called pen, and then dying. Okay? There were people living in these early Anglo-Saxon settlements that were British, but they had a lower social status. So, for example, there's something called, I can see time is going very quickly now, I've only got a few minutes, something called weregild, man value. If I killed killed Chara now, okay, I would have to pay to his family a certain amount of money according to his value. his man price. Okay? Now, the weregild of Anglo-Saxon men was higher than these Welsh slaves, whatever they were, these Welsh people. So they existed, but they had a lower social status. And what they're suggesting here is, as we said, as Burcham was saying, there may be intermarriage between the different groups, but the apartheid system, as they're calling it here, okay, means that Anglo-Saxon men were allowed to marry British women, for example, but perhaps because of their lower status, either legally or just in practice, the British women couldn't get an Anglo-Saxon wife. It wasn't something that happened. So the British men were not spreading their Y chromosomes as quickly as the English men did. The Anglo-Saxons could have Anglo-Saxon wives and British wives, so they were spreading their Y chromosomes broadly during a 100, 200 year period, whereas the British were being more controlled, being limited. And as a result, we see the disappearance gradually of the British DNA in these societies because they just don't get to marry so much or whatever. Whereas in the areas over here where the Anglo-Saxons didn't settle so much or at all, then the British DNA survives because they are spreading their DNA by marriage and by, I presume, non-marital unions as well. So, yeah, we won't have time to look at paper number 2, I'm afraid, but what this shows, the point I'm trying to make here by putting these two papers together, is that the DNA evidence is great, okay, it's very exciting. We've got whole books. Here's one of my books. We've got this in the library, and there's a couple of others, and our rector is very interested in this kind of thing as well. We had a few conversations, he and I, about that. This is, I think, a very important and kind of revolutionary stage in understanding the past. There are a few problems with it. On the one hand, we need to work together. We need the geneticists to work with historians because we are not capable of understanding the genetics, not yet, but maybe a new generation of geneto-historians or archaeologists or something will emerge who can do both sides. And the historians are the ones who think about the documentary evidence and can think of the interpretations. And so often, it's not the simplest pattern which is the true one. Just kind of large numbers of people marching over and taking over and spreading their genes. There could be other, more subtle ways in which genetic patterns can be built up and changed over time. Okay.
I think the first article is too simple. I don't mean it easy, but it generalizes a lot, so it didn't take into consideration the social points like in the third.
Yes, yes, and all the authors for that one, though Mark Thomas is very famous for doing this kind of work, and he's given papers all over the place. I've seen him lecture and so on, and he's written about Jewish settlers in parts of Africa that we can find their DNA for and things like that. So, but yes, okay, it was a very simplistic one. Though there's plenty of facts and figures to build up their argument, whereas the other paper is perhaps overly clever, I don't know, but it's trying to redress the balance. And probably in the next kind of generation or so, we'll build up methods for interpreting this kind of stuff, and even the viral DNA or something, and get a more fixed methodology, if there's going to be one, for how we can interpret this material. And obviously, the more aDNA we can get, the stronger the case for comparing modern and ancient DNA as well. Okay, time's up, so I shall give you bibliography for next week. Oh, not for next week, we're starting this topic on Thursday, of course, aren't we, with having lost a class due to the Bayram the other week. I don't seem to have a volunteer for the presentation for this. So anyone who hasn't put their name down for a presentation, if you wish to talk about the politics of early Anglo-Saxon England or pre-Viking Wales or pre-Viking Scotland, then you can let me know now. You'll give your presentation probably a week from now, okay? If no one volunteers, because we've got plenty of spare slots, then it'll be 100% David, okay? Anyone? No? Yik, yak, yok? Okay then, right, I shall prepare a PowerPoint show and more slides, and we'll talk more about the political side rather than the demographic side of this very early medieval period. Okay, have a nice evening. See you all. So we give it an English name, okay? But in this case, there must have been at least one Briton alive, maybe on the gasping breath to say, "Pen," and then he dies. But more likely, okay, there was some degree of cultural activity, maybe even a large British-speaking population continued there. They kept their own place name. It wasn't replaced by an English one. So we get a degree of coexistence or whatever up to a point. And this is primarily in the Midlands, these place names, mostly in the Midlands of England, not so much in the west, in the south and the east, in the Midlands. So as we move to the Midlands, as the English kind of move into this area, okay, we get more and more of these Welsh place names, suggesting at least in the central parts we get more of an interaction, okay. Perhaps not so much in these areas, but certainly around here we get a more interactive situation emerging. Okay, another map, this time showing the western parts of Britain primarily, okay. Here we see two things indicated, okay. The dots, lobs, show sites where archaeologists have found what they call, in focusing in the southern part of Britain and to some extent in the eastern side, but moving into the Midlands a little bit over here as well. And obviously the Anglo-Saxons, again, we'll talk about this in detail next time, but the Anglo-Saxons were pagan primarily when they arrived in Britain, but during the 6th and into the 7th century we see the conversion of different Anglo-Saxon groups, kingdoms, to Christianity. So where we see a name which has a pagan significance, it indicates not necessarily the beginning, but relatively early settlement. Okay, these are the areas where the pagan Anglo-Saxons were occupying an area or taking over a settlement or setting up a new settlement and things like that. And this, more or less, but to a lesser extent, reflects the same map that we looked at before. It's this area of early settlement. On the other hand, a different place name map, which I don't know how clear that is for you over there again, but these are place names which indicate some degree of British or Welsh continuity. Okay? They indicate that people who were regarded as Britons or Welsh by the English were surviving. So they are place names which either have Welsh elements in, but the English have taken over the name. Okay, so I think this one here is Pen, okay, which is the Welsh, modern Welsh word with one N for head, for example. Now, one scenario, one very common scenario for the Anglo-Saxon movement into Britain was that it was a fairly large-scale and rather violent event, so that the Anglo-Saxons came in and more or less killed the native Britons or pushed them further westwards into Wales and Cornwall and so on, and then took over the main part of what became, therefore, England. This kind of evidence suggests perhaps otherwise, that other patterns were going on. If you have places, this one is called Comberton. Let me write that one up because you can't see it very well. Okay, ton is the word town in English. So this is an English place name, but the Comber bit, okay, is related to, well, the modern Welsh word for a Welshman. Cymro means a Welshman in Welsh, okay. Combroges or something in earlier Welsh. So this is the town of the Welshman. Okay, so this suggests, if we interpret it correctly, that this was a settlement in which some Britons, or Welsh if we want to call them, were living at the time when the English arrived, and they were not obviously completely wiped out in that sense. And then somewhere with the name Pen, which actually has a Welsh name, this is a Welsh word, okay. Now if you're all the Welsh, and I come marching in, Anglo-Saxon David, and kill you all, and then say, okay, let's live here. What's this place called? But you're all dead, so you can't tell me what it's called. Okay, actually, Özge has just gone out, but I'd like us to start because I've got quite a lot to say or a few maps to look at before we then move on to our DNA articles and so on. So let's briefly kind of remind ourselves of the point we reached in the last class, and then we'll try and follow that through in a kind of logical way. So we've been looking at the movement of peoples around Britain and to some extent Ireland. We'll say a bit about those today and more, I think, on Thursday about next week about Ireland, during the late and sub-Roman periods. So here is a map which, based on primarily archaeological finds, argues the situation for Kirka round about AD 500. We can ignore these kingdom names at the moment. We're going to start dealing with the sort of political situation, if that's the right word, on Thursday, but we're concerned more with people situation here. But you can see we've got, you may not be able to see, we've got Jutes, Saxons and Angles here. We talked about those and we tried to compare the archaeological finds from Britain with the continent last week. And this is the situation in terms of artifacts which archaeologists believe indicate some kind of English or Anglo-Saxon presence on a relatively large scale by the end of the 5th century. Obviously, this grey area will slowly expand during the next 100 years, and we'll be starting to look at that on Thursday, and we'll look at these names, as I said. What I'm going to do now is have a look a little bit at the other side, what's going on elsewhere. But before we do that, let's just take a few maps which indicate onomastic place name evidence to supplement this kind of archaeological stuff. Here is a map showing English place names which refer to Anglo-Saxon pagan practices in one way or another. Now, for example, we talked about the pagan god Woden last week briefly, and a number of place names preserve the name Woden. We've got a few here. Let me have a look so I can see. Wednesfield or something like that here, Whedon and so on. And also the god Thunor, Thor for the Vikings of course, and we see Thunderfield and so on here. So these place names primarily